It began in a cold workshop at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, 1942. The United States had entered the war late, and already the reports from North Africa were grim. American infantrymen were brave, but underarmed. When German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks appeared on the horizon, nothing the average soldier carried could stop them. Rifle bullets bounced off like raindrops on armor. Anti-tank rifles were obsolete. The only hope lay in cumbersome 37mm guns, which took a crew of several men and time the battlefield never allowed. Infantry were being crushed beneath steel, and morale was cracking. In that crisis, two men decided to gamble on something radical. A weapon so small, so light, it could be carried by one soldier, yet powerful enough to kill a tank. They were Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Skinner, an ordnance officer, and Edward Ull, a young engineer with a mind for impossible problems. One day, while sorting through scrap metal, Ull found a piece of steel tubing roughly 5 feet long. He held it up and said, "If only I could find a way to shoot a rocket from this." Skinner looked at him and replied, "Then let's do it." That afternoon, history began to change. They started with a rocket, a 2.36-inch diameter tube packed with explosives and fitted with a shaped charge, designed to focus its blast into a narrow jet capable of melting armor. It was crude, dangerous, and unpredictable. The first tests were done with makeshift sights and wires. The launch tube was open at both ends, one for the rocket, one for the backblast. The first prototype nearly burned Ull's hands off, but it worked. The rocket left the tube, flew straight, and punched through an old tank plate. Skinner reportedly turned to Ull and said, "That's the sound of infantry being free again." The concept was revolutionary. A lightweight, shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher that required only 2 men to operate, a gunner and a loader. The weapon was officially designated the M1 rocket launcher, but the soldiers quickly gave it another name. During a demonstration to visiting generals, someone remarked that it looked like the strange homemade trombone used by radio comedian Bob Burns, known as the Bazooka. The name stuck. From that moment, it was no longer just a weapon. It was the Bazooka. Production began immediately, even before perfection. Factories across America, from Detroit to Hartford, retooled their lines overnight. The design was simple: a hollow steel tube, a trigger circuit powered by 2 dry cell batteries, and a shoulder rest. It fired a rocket weighing about 3.5 pounds, which could travel nearly 100 yards and penetrate more than 3 inches of armor. That might not sound like much, but on the battlefields of 1943, it was enough to crack open any German tank from the side or rear. For the first time, the American infantrymen had a weapon that could stare down armor and win. The first units were shipped to North Africa in late 1942, during Operation Torch. In the dusty battlefields near Tunisia, soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division used the new weapon against German half-tracks and machine gun nests. The results were immediate and terrifying. The rockets left a trail of smoke and struck with a flash of molten fire. It was like holding lightning, one soldier wrote in a letter home. You'd aim, fire, and the world just blew open. But the real test came in Sicily, July 1943. American infantry landed under heavy resistance facing entrenched German armor. The bazookas were unproven in large-scale combat. 2-man teams crawled through olive groves and rubble, waiting for tanks to pass. When a Panzer IV rolled by, a gunner named Corporal Joe Palmer of the 3rd Infantry Division aimed at the tank's side armor from 60 yards. The rocket hit, and to the astonishment of everyone watching, the Panzer stopped cold, smoke pouring from its hatches. The whole platoon froze, Palmer recalled. We didn't cheer. We just stared. We'd done something nobody thought possible. Within months, the bazooka became legend. Soldiers learned to trust it, to treat it as an equalizer. 2 men, crouched together, could do what once required artillery. The loader carried a pack of rockets strapped to his back like a quiver. The gunner carried the launcher, warm from smoke and heat. They moved like shadows, always in pairs, always relying on one another. If the loader hesitated, the gunner was dead. If the gunner missed, they both were. Their survival depended on rhythm, load, fire, move. The weapon wasn't perfect. Its backblast gave away their position, its rockets sometimes misfired, and it required bravery of the highest order because it was most effective at short range, often less than 75 yards. But to the men who used it, those flaws didn't matter. It gave them something priceless, the power to fight back. By late 1943, the M9A1 Bazooka, an improved version with better sights and collapsible tube, entered service. It could be broken down into two halves for easier transport and used a refined electric trigger instead of fragile batteries. Training manuals spread across the Army, and soon every infantry company had dedicated two-man bazooka teams. Instructors taught soldiers to aim at the sides of tanks, to use cover, and to hold their fire until they could see the tracks. Wait until you can smell the engine, one sergeant warned, then you can kill it. When General Eisenhower saw the weapon demonstrated, he reportedly smiled and said, "Give me 1,000 of these, and I'll trade them for 1,000 tanks." In less than a year, the bazooka had gone from an experimental tube to a symbol of infantry defiance, the weapon that gave ordinary soldiers the courage to face armor alone. It was more than steel and wires. It was a promise. No man would ever again have to watch helplessly as a tank crushed his position. And soon, on the fields of Normandy and in the snow of Bastogne, two-man teams armed with these tubes of thunder would prove that promise true, holding their ground against steel beasts that once seemed invincible, and changing forever how war would be fought by men on foot.
A bazooka was never fired by one man. It was never meant to be. On the battlefield, it lived and breathed through two men, a gunner and a loader, bound together by a weapon that demanded perfect trust. Every time they pulled the trigger, both lives hung on timing, coordination, and a few inches of aim. A single mistake, a misplaced rocket, a breath too early, a flash of backblast, could mean death for both. Yet across Europe and the Pacific, these pairs of soldiers became the unspoken heroes of modern warfare, small, exposed, and armed with nothing but courage and a steel tube that spat lightning. The U.S. Army manual described it clinically. The bazooka team consists of a gunner and an assistant, a loader. The gunner aims and fires, the assistant loads and observes results. But reality was far more intimate. These two men moved like one body. The loader carried the ammunition, 6 or more rockets in canvas tubes slung across his back. The gunner shouldered the weapon, his finger resting near the trigger contact, eyes fixed through the crude open sights. The loader crouched behind, always lower, feeding the rocket into the rear of the tube and shouting, "Up!" That single word meant everything. It meant the weapon was live, and that any second now a jet of fire would roar from the back. Firing a bazooka was nothing like the movies. It wasn't clean or cinematic. The backblast burst out like a small explosion, hot enough to burn skin, strong enough to kill a man standing too close behind. The gunner had to trust that his partner was clear. The loader had to trust that the gunner wouldn't fire too soon. When you pulled the trigger, one veteran of the 4th Infantry Division recalled, you could feel the blast kick against your lungs. It was like standing in front of a furnace that hated you. They trained together for weeks before being sent to the front. In training fields from Fort Benning to Tidworth Barracks, pairs of soldiers practiced the rhythm: load, aim, fire, duck, reload, relocate. The teams learned to communicate with gestures more than words. A tap on the shoulder meant ready. A raised hand meant not yet. Some even developed small rituals before battle. One team always knocked the launcher 3 times before the first shot, calling it their luck knock. Another drew chalk tally marks on the tube for every tank they'd hit. By 1944, the bazooka had become a brotherhood of pairs. Some gunners were older men, calm, steady, experienced in battle. Loaders were often younger, teenagers drafted straight from high school, nervous but determined. The contrast between them became its own form of survival. The older gunner steadied the younger's hands. The younger's energy kept the pair moving. It was like an old dog and a pup, said Private James Carver, who fought in Normandy with the 29th Infantry Division. He told me when to breathe, when to run, when to reload. I did everything but think. The pair had to be brave in a way few others understood. Bazooka teams were often detached from their squads and sent forward alone to ambush tanks or destroy pillboxes. That meant crawling through ditches, hiding in hedgerows, and waiting, sometimes for hours, for a target to appear. The tension was suffocating. The sound of tank tracks, that deep metallic growl, grew louder and louder until it filled their chests. The gunner whispered, "Wait for the flank." The loader whispered back, "Copy." Both waited until the tank was within 50 yards, sometimes less. They could smell the oil and exhaust. Then, a breath, a squeeze. The rocket left the tube with a shriek, streaking toward the moving wall of steel. Sometimes it hit perfectly, the shaped charge burrowing through armor, sending the turret flying. Sometimes it missed, or bounced off, or hit too soon. And when it did, the tank's turret would swivel toward them like the eye of a predator. At that point, there was no time to think, only to run. The loader grabbed another rocket, the gunner dropped flat, and both prayed they'd get a second chance before the tank's machine guns opened fire. There were countless such duos across Europe. In Normandy, Sergeant Harold Simmons and Private Roy Keller destroyed 4 German armored vehicles in a single day near St. Lo. Their position was nearly overrun, but they refused to retreat. Keller reloaded under fire, shouting over the roar, "Another one! Another one!" Simmons fired until the barrel smoked. When the battle ended, they were both deaf for 3 days, but alive. "He was my eyes," Simmons said later, "and he was my hands." In Italy, 2 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, Corporal Red Drummond and his loader Henry Lee, faced a Panzer IV at close range during the Battle of Anzio. They let it come within 30 yards before firing, the rocket hitting square under the turret ring. The explosion flipped the tank on its side. Later, Lee said quietly, "I didn't even hear the shot, just saw the flash and thought, thank God we didn't blink." By the time of Bastogne, the Bazooka team had become an icon of infantry courage. In the freezing forests of the Ardennes, small groups of 2-man teams held crossroads and villages against waves of tanks. The loader carried rockets under his coat to keep the fuses from freezing. The gunner wiped frost from the sight. They fired until their fingers bled and their rockets ran out. And when the tanks finally stopped coming, they leaned on each other, half blind, half deaf, but unbroken. That partnership was deeper than orders or rank. It was instinct, trust, and survival condensed into a 2-man equation. Many said they'd rather go into battle with their bazooka partner than anyone else in the platoon. "We were like older brothers," remembered Private Carver, "because brothers argue. We didn't have time for that." The bazooka's power came from chemistry, not chemicals, but the bond between 2 men who believed in each other. The gunner provided the aim, the loader the nerve. Together, they faced things no human should: the grinding approach of tanks, the whine of machine guns, the blinding flash of their own weapon. They learned to control fear by focusing on each other. When everything else failed, when the radio was dead, when the squad was gone, all that mattered was the hand that loaded the next rocket and the eyes that found the target. By the end of 1944, tens of thousands of bazooka teams had taken their place in every corner of the Allied front. They had stopped tanks, destroyed bunkers, and, in moments of quiet, shared cigarettes beside the warm barrel of their launchers, laughing at how something so ugly could save their lives. They were the smallest unit on the battlefield, just 2 men, yet they carried the weight of armies on their shoulders. And in the months to come, as the snow fell over the hedgerows of France and the steel monsters of Germany advanced once more, these pairs would again be called upon to do the impossible, to hold the line when there was nowhere left to run.
The morning fog of Normandy was the kind that swallowed sound and breath. In the early days after D-Day, June 1944, American infantry moved through fields bordered by thick hedgerows, ancient walls of earth and tangled roots that turned every acre into a fortress. Somewhere beyond each bend, German panzers waited. The men could hear them before they saw them, the low metallic growl of engines, the grinding of treads chewing through mud. It was in those narrow, claustrophobic lanes that the bazooka team earned its legend. The bazooka was never a weapon of comfort. To use it well, you had to wait, not until you saw the tank, but until you could see the details, the insignia on the turret, the glint of the driver's visor, the mud clinging to the treads. The gunner's job wasn't to be fast, it was to be fearless. You waited until you could smell the exhaust, said Private Harold Benton, 4th Infantry Division. If you fired too soon, it just bounced off, so you waited, and you prayed you'd still be alive to pull the trigger.
In the Brokage country near San Lo, Benton and his loader, Ray Martinez, lay flat under a hedgerow as a Panzer IV rolled past barely 50 yards away. The ground shook. Benton held his breath and whispered, "Not yet." When the tank exposed its side armor, he raised the tube, sighted on the rear road wheel, and squeezed. The rocket hissed from the tube, trailed smoke, and slammed into the tank's flank. A flash of orange erupted, followed by a blast that blew the turret clean off. Martinez shouted, "Hit!" The tank stopped burning after 5 minutes, but the smell of melted steel lingered for hours. Benton never forgot it. "We weren't brave," he said later. "We were just too scared to miss." Every village in Normandy had stories like that. 2-man bazooka teams hunted tanks like wolves. They hid in ditches, behind stone walls, inside barns. They fought close, too close. The air was thick with cordite and fear. When a tank went up, the blast threw debris for yards, and the concussion left men deaf for minutes. Yet those 2-man teams turned the tide of many fights. At Carentan, a handful of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne destroyed 3 armored half-tracks and forced an entire column to retreat. It was a poor man's artillery, one officer said, but it gave the poor man a chance. Still, Normandy was only the beginning. 6 months later, in the freezing hell of Bastogne, the bazooka team became something mythic, the last line of defense in a world made of snow, steel, and silence. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had begun. The Germans launched their final counterattack through the Ardennes, and the town of Bastogne became the center of their assault. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, cut off and surrounded, faced the full fury of Hitler's armored divisions. For days, the snow never stopped. Artillery pounded the forests. Visibility dropped to nothing. And from the fog, the tanks came. The men of Bastogne were freezing, hungry, exhausted, and almost out of ammunition. The snow-jammed rifles, machine guns froze solid, but the bazooka still fired. Even in sub-zero temperatures, its simple design endured. 2-man teams moved through the woods like phantoms, carrying their tubes under blankets to keep the triggers from icing. One such team, Sergeant Paul Dutch Henning and his loader Billy Hart, held the road near the village of Foy. At dawn, they heard engines rumbling. German Stug 3 assault guns, low and squat, advancing through the snow. The men could barely see 20 yards ahead. Henning whispered, "Load it, Tully." Hart slid the rocket into the tube, his hands trembling. "Upped," he shouted, then ducked. The blast lit up the fog, the rocket streaking out like a comet. It struck the Stug square on the side plate. A flash of orange erupted, followed by a blast that blew the turret clean off. Martinez shouted, "Hit!" The tank stopped burning after 5 minutes, but the smell of melted steel lingered for hours. Benton never forgot it. "We weren't brave," he said later. "We were just too scared to miss." Everywhere in Bastogne, stories like that repeated. The 327th Glider Infantry used bazookas to break up German infantry supported by half-tracks. The 501st PIR ambushed tanks at crossroads, waiting in silence until the enemy was within 50 yards, then firing from both sides of the road. One team even crawled onto the back of a Sherman tank, using its hull as cover as they took shots at German armor in the next field. "You could feel the earth shaking from the engines," one gunner recalled. "You didn't think, you just aimed for the weak spot and fired." The courage it took was unimaginable. To fire a bazooka meant exposing yourself. You couldn't hide behind cover, couldn't miss, couldn't flinch. You had to stand, aim, and trust your partner to cover you. Many never made it to a second shot, but those who did became legends in silence. They didn't boast, they just wiped the frost off the tube, reloaded, and waited for the next one. During one of the final assaults on December 23rd, as the siege tightened, a bazooka team from the 10th Armored Division, Corporal Walter Price and Private Leon Parker, defended a bridge near Hemrula. They had only 3 rockets left. A column of panzer tanks appeared out of the mist. The first shot missed. The second hit but didn't penetrate. The third struck true, piercing the side armor and igniting the fuel. The panzer burned until nightfall. When relief came days later, rescuers found their bodies beside the launcher, still facing the direction of the road. By Christmas Eve, Bastogne's defenders were nearly out of ammunition, yet the limes held.
because wherever a tank appeared, 2 men with the bazooka were waiting. They were cold, half-starved, and surrounded, but they still had their weapon, and each other. "We didn't feel like heroes," one survivor said. "We just knew if we ran, no one else would stop them." When the siege was lifted and Patton's tanks finally broke through, the roads around Bastogne were littered with the carcasses of German armor, dozens of them, each with a fist-size hole burned through the flank. Beside many, rescuers found the empty tubes of bazookas, their paint blistered by fire and cold. Some were still clutched in frozen hands. Those 2-man teams had done what armies of millions could not. They had turned hopeless defense into defiance. In the snow and mud of Europe, they proved that bravery wasn't about numbers or size. It was about trust, timing, and the will to stand your ground. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of Bastogne, the bazooka teams had rewritten the rules of infantry warfare. They had shown that courage could fit in 2 hearts, and victory in the hands of 2 men and a steel tube no wider than a man's wrist.
In Europe, the bazooka became a legend in snow and mud. In the Pacific, it was reborn in fire and rain. Where the hedgerows of Normandy had muffled sound, the jungles of the Philippines swallowed it whole. The enemy wasn't the gray steel of the Panzer, it was the green camouflage of Japanese tanks, the concrete teeth of bunkers carved into cliffs, and the soldiers who would rather die than surrender. Against that kind of fanaticism, the bazooka team once again became the weapon of last resort. 2 men with a tube facing an empire. When the Americans returned to the Philippines in late 1944, the battles were unlike anything seen in Europe. The heat was crushing, the humidity thick enough to choke, weapons rusted overnight, ammunition swelled and jammed. The jungle itself was an enemy, alive, wet, and unrelenting. Yet through the chaos of vines and gunfire, the crack of the M9A1 bazooka echoed like thunder trapped in a cage. The improved M9A1 was lighter, easier to handle, and far deadlier than its predecessor. It had a folding tube for easier transport and a better sight for range adjustment. Its rocket, with a redesigned shaped charge warhead, could punch through 4 inches of armor, enough to burn through the side of a Japanese Type 95 Hago or pierce the reinforced concrete of a pillbox. The weapon's light weight, only 15 pounds, made it ideal for the Marines and soldiers slogging through terrain where vehicles couldn't go. But nothing could make the work of a bazooka team in the Pacific easy. On Luzon, Leyte, and Okinawa, they fought at point-blank range in rain that never stopped, against bunkers hidden under roots and caves defended by suicide squads. You could see the whites of their eyes before you pulled the trigger, remembered Corporal Stanley Wong of the 37th Infantry Division. Sometimes the target wasn't a tank, it was a machine gun nest that had already killed half your platoon. In Luzon, January 1945, a 2-man team, Private First Class Arthur Morales and Sergeant Bill Horn, crept up a ridge under fire from a Japanese bunker carved into volcanic rock. Rifle grenades had failed, flamethrowers couldn't reach. Morales carried the launcher, Horn dragged the rockets through mud that came up to his knees. They reached a position 40 yards from the bunker, hearts pounding in their throats. Horn loaded the first rocket and shouted, "Up!" Morales aimed at the dark slit of the firing port and squeezed. The rocket slammed home, the shape charge focusing its blast inward. The bunker erupted in flame. The second rocket sealed the entrance. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was silent. Morales later said, "We didn't think about being heroes. We just didn't want anyone else to die trying." Across the Pacific, similar stories repeated themselves. On Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash turned every step into agony, Marine bazooka teams worked side by side with flamethrower operators, clearing pillboxes one by one. The Japanese fought from tunnels, popping up unexpectedly behind American lines. The only weapon light enough to move quickly, but strong enough to destroy those fortifications, was the bazooka. "We called it our key," said one Marine sergeant. "When you couldn't open the door with bullets, you opened it with a rocket." At Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific,
Bazooka teams faced not just bunkers, but tanks, the fast, nimble Type 97 Chiha and the smaller Ha-Go. Though thinly armored compared to German tanks, they were deadly in the tight terrain of ridges and cane fields. On May 13, 1945, during an attack near Shuri Castle, 2 Marines, Lance Corporal David Green and Private Harold Evers, held a crossroads against a Japanese counterattack. They had 4 rockets left. When the first tank appeared, they waited, crouched behind a collapsed wall. Green whispered, "Closer." At 40 yards, he fired. The rocket slammed home, the shape charge focusing its blast inward. The bunker erupted in flame. The second rocket sealed the entrance. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was silent. Morales later said, "We didn't think about being heroes. We just didn't want anyone else to die trying." Across the Pacific, similar stories repeated themselves. On Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash turned every step into agony, Marine bazooka teams worked side by side with flamethrower operators, clearing pillboxes one by one. The Japanese fought from tunnels, popping up unexpectedly behind American lines. The only weapon light enough to move quickly, but strong enough to destroy those fortifications, was the bazooka. "We called it our key," said one Marine sergeant. "When you couldn't open the door with bullets, you opened it with a rocket." At Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific, bazooka teams faced not just bunkers, but tanks, the fast, nimble Type 97 Chiha and the smaller Ha-Go. Though thinly armored compared to German tanks, they were deadly in the tight terrain of ridges and cane fields. On May 13, 1945, during an attack near Shuri Castle, 2 Marines, Lance Corporal David Green and Private Harold Evers, held a crossroads against a Japanese counterattack. They had 4 rockets left. When the first tank appeared, they waited, crouched behind a collapsed wall. Green whispered, "Closer." At 40 yards, he fired. The rocket slammed home, the shape charge focusing its blast inward. The bunker erupted in flame. The second rocket sealed the entrance. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was silent. Morales later said, "We didn't think about being heroes. We just didn't want anyone else to die trying." Across the Pacific, similar stories repeated themselves. On Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash turned every step into agony, Marine bazooka teams worked side by side with flamethrower operators, clearing pillboxes one by one. The Japanese fought from tunnels, popping up unexpectedly behind American lines. The only weapon light enough to move quickly, but strong enough to destroy those fortifications, was the bazooka. "We called it our key," said one Marine sergeant. "When you couldn't open the door with bullets, you opened it with a rocket." At Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific, bazooka teams faced not just bunkers, but tanks, the fast, nimble Type 97 Chiha and the smaller Ha-Go. Though thinly armored compared to German tanks, they were deadly in the tight terrain of ridges and cane fields. On May 13, 1945, during an attack near Shuri Castle, 2 Marines, Lance Corporal David Green and Private Harold Evers, held a crossroads against a Japanese counterattack. They had 4 rockets left. When the first tank appeared, they waited, crouched behind a collapsed wall. Green whispered, "Closer." At 40 yards, he fired. The rocket slammed home, the shape charge focusing its blast inward. The bunker erupted in flame. The second rocket sealed the entrance. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was silent. Morales later said, "We didn't think about being heroes. We just didn't want anyone else to die trying." Across the Pacific, similar stories repeated themselves. On Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash turned every step into agony, Marine bazooka teams worked side by side with flamethrower operators, clearing pillboxes one by one. The Japanese fought from tunnels, popping up unexpectedly behind American lines. The only weapon light enough to move quickly, but strong enough to destroy those fortifications, was the bazooka. "We called it our key," said one Marine sergeant. "When you couldn't open the door with bullets, you opened it with a rocket." At Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific, bazooka teams faced not just bunkers, but tanks, the fast, nimble Type 97 Chiha and the smaller Ha-Go.
Though thinly armored compared to German tanks, they were deadly in the tight terrain of ridges and cane fields. On May 13, 1945, during an attack near Shuri Castle, 2 Marines, Lance Corporal David Green and Private Harold Evers, held a crossroads against a Japanese counterattack. They had 4 rockets left. When the first tank appeared, they waited, crouched behind a collapsed wall. Green whispered, "Closer." At 40 yards, he fired. The rocket slammed home, the shape charge focusing its blast inward. The bunker erupted in flame. The second rocket sealed the entrance. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was silent. Morales later said, "We didn't think about being heroes. We just didn't want anyone else to die trying." Across the Pacific, similar stories repeated themselves. On Iwo Jima, where volcanic ash turned every step into agony, Marine bazooka teams worked side by side with flamethrower operators, clearing pillboxes one by one. The Japanese fought from tunnels, popping up unexpectedly behind American lines. The only weapon light enough to move quickly, but strong enough to destroy those fortifications, was the bazooka. "We called it our key," said one Marine sergeant. "When you couldn't open the door with bullets, you opened it with a rocket." At Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific, bazooka teams faced not just bunkers, but tanks, the fast, nimble Type 97 Chiha and the smaller Ha-Go. Though thinly armored compared to German tanks, they were deadly in the tight terrain of ridges and cane fields. On May 13, 1945, during an attack near Shuri Castle, 2 Marines, Lance Corporal David Green and Private Harold Evers, held a crossroads against a Japanese counterattack. They had 4 rockets left. When the first tank appeared, they waited, crouched behind a collapsed wall. Green whispered, "Closer." At 40 yards, he fired. The rocket slammed home, the shape charge focusing its blast inward. The bunker erupted in flame. The second rocket sealed.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world began to measure what it had lost and what it had gained. Cities lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and the old ways of war were dead. But out of that destruction, a new truth had been forged in fire and courage: the power of the 2-man team. And at the center of that truth stood the weapon that embodied it, the bazooka, and the men who carried it. The bazooka had done more than kill tanks. It had rewritten the rules of warfare. Before it, a single armored vehicle could dominate an entire company. After it, 2 men with a steel tube could stop a division cold. It wasn't just a new weapon, it was a revolution. For the first time in history, infantrymen didn't have to wait for artillery or air support to deal with armor. They could fight back, instantly, from the mud and rubble of the battlefield. And they did. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the volcanic ridges of Okinawa, from the frozen forests of Bastogne to the rice paddies of Luzon, the bazooka teams proved that courage, when paired with ingenuity, could balance the odds. Even the enemy admitted it. Captured German reports called the weapon Der Donnerrohr, the thunder pipe. Japanese officers described it as the lightning that hunts tanks. And after the war, their engineers copied it. The German Panzerschreck and the later Soviet RPG-2 both owed their existence to the American bazooka. Its design inspired a new generation of weapons: the M20 Super Bazooka, the British PIAT successors, and eventually the shoulder-fired rockets that would define post-war combat for the next century. But none carried quite the same spirit, because the bazooka wasn't just a machine, it was a partnership. Every soldier who carried it knew that the weapon was only as good as the bond between its 2 operators. The gunner trusted the loader with his life. The loader trusted the gunner to aim true. They weren't just soldiers, they were halves of the same heart. In the chaos of battle, when shells screamed overhead and tanks closed in, there was no time for speeches or orders. There was only the shared breath before the shot, the unspoken timing, the brief moment when both hearts beat as one. One veteran of the 90th Infantry Division once said, "You didn't think about the tank, you thought about the man next to you. If he was ready, you fired. If he wasn't, you waited, even if it killed you." That spirit became the soul of modern infantry warfare. The two-man anti-tank team became standard doctrine for armies around the world, a permanent reminder of what two men could do when they refused to yield. But beyond tactics and design, there was something deeper, something human. The Bazooka team embodied the essence of every soldier's fight: small, outnumbered, terrified, but standing firm. They were proof that technology alone doesn't win wars, people do. The Bazooka gave them power, but it was their courage that made it history. In the aftermath of the war, many of those teams went home quietly. They became farmers, factory workers, teachers, fathers. Few ever talked about what they had done. When asked, they'd shrug and say, "We just did our job." But for those who served beside them, the memory never faded. The flash of the rocket, the smell of burnt cordite, the shout of "up" before the world exploded. And as new wars came, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, the echo of those two-man teams lived on. The M20 Super Bazooka, the Law, the AT-4, the Javelin, all were descendants of that humble tube first tested in 1942. Each one carried the DNA of a weapon that changed how infantry fought forever. Yet even as the technology evolved, the heart of it remained unchanged. Two men, one weapon, one unbreakable bond. In 1950, during the Korean War, a photograph captured a moment that seemed to bridge the past and present. A young American soldier kneeling in the snow, bazooka on his shoulder, his loader standing behind him, rocket in hand. It could have been Normandy. It could have been Bastogne. The faces changed, the landscape changed, but the posture, the unity stayed the same. That image became an unspoken memorial to every pair that had come before. Years later, historians would describe the bazooka as a weapon of equality, a machine that gave the common soldier a fighting chance against the impossible. But among those who actually fired it, the word equality never came up. They called it something else. They called it faith. Faith in their weapon, faith in their partner, faith that no matter how strong the enemy seemed, they could still make a difference. The engineers who built the bazooka didn't know they were creating a symbol. They just wanted to solve a problem. But what they gave the world was more than metal and powder. They gave the infantryman something he hadn't had before: hope. Hope that he could stand against steel and not break. Hope that he could look into the mouth of a tank and still pull the trigger. Hope that even when the odds were impossible, courage could even them out. And so, long after the last bazooka was retired, its legacy lived on, not in museums or manuals, but in every soldier who picks up a weapon and turns to the man beside him before the fight begins. Because in every war since, somewhere on every battlefield, there are still two men, one carrying the tube, the other the rocket, whispering the same words their forefathers once did in Normandy, Bastogne, and the Philippines. You ready? Yeah, let's make it count. That was the creed of the bazooka team and the heartbeat of the infantry itself. Two men, one weapon, infinite courage. They didn't just hold the line. They became the line.